I had no intention of seeing Top Gun Maverick. I had no interest. I wasn't dumb or shallow enough to take an interest in Top Gun back in the day when I was a teenager when that was out. I wasn't interested in that. I'm certainly not interested in the sequel. But some of these reviews are so interesting in what they're saying about it that I think I might watch it. They're kind of calling it like an elegy to that America, to an America that would have produced a movie like Top Gun and been able to take it seriously and enjoy it.
Well, that came out what, mid '80s.
Mid '80s, and
Yeah.
it was very you're the best, it's all that kind of stuff. That was never my kind of thing. It was always too ridiculous for me. Like really, even at that time, I wasn't interested in that movie. I saw it because you couldn't avoid it. It was everywhere back then. It was one of the
Right.
hugest
Yeah.
hits of that era. I didn't see it in the movies, but I definitely saw it on cable at some point. Um, but yeah, I mean, they're saying kind of the movie has this kind of self-awareness of itself as a dinosaur, and it's kind of using Tom Cruise to himself as kind of symbolic of the end of a time when movie stars would be like Tom Cruise starring in movies like Top Gun. That like that whole America is gone, and that the movie has this very mournful overtone about it. Um, that is very much, when I read that, I thought about it, and I keep saying like 80s and 90s, yes, yes, we had terrible, terrible problems. It was a better America than the America we live in, and anybody who's going to say, well, but what about advancing the rights? Okay, look at the numbers. Look at that would be an argument if the numbers supported it. But black poverty rates and incarceration rates are worse than they were then. So what are you talking about? The substantive things that make up a community, that make up life, those are not improved for people of color. You haven't raised up those groups. You've just dragged down everybody. So overall, it's a worse country for everyone to be living in. So yeah, it's interesting that at this time they're making this Top Gun sequel because Cruise resisted doing it. That's why they didn't do it. I mean, obviously, that was such a hit. They wanted to do a sequel right after that back then. And he's
Right.
resisted and resisted and resisted doing it for all these decades. This is what's interesting about Tom Cruise. Like I have a personal boycott on him. I won't. Yes, you have a right under. I certainly believing in freedom of speech as I do. You have a right to promote Scientology. I have a right to boycott you because you promote Scientology. So I will not pay for a Tom Cruise movie. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to wait to see this until it's on cable. I've always thought Tom Cruise was a very, very gifted artist, his crazy religious beliefs aside. I've always thought he was really one
Oh
of the
yeah,
most
he's a
gifted
good
actors of his
actor. Yeah.
generation.
Yeah.
Uh, Very interesting choices. You watch him in Magnolia. It's fucking, that performance is genius.
Oh yeah. Well,
Um,
that's an amazing part. I mean, that's just an amazing role.
so, like, the idea that Tom Cruise would do this very self aware interpretation of Maverick as a character, as a way of commenting on his own Twilight. Yeah, I wouldn't put that past him. He's that smart and complex and interesting that he would do. So you wouldn't think it till you're interviewed. But if you
Well,
look
it's
at his
true. I
work
mean,
as an artist, yeah, I could see that.
it's true. I mean, well, there's that other movie, that Nicolas Cage movie, right? The unbearable weight of extreme talent, basically like a self parody, like of this actor who's had ups and downs. Um, because there was a time when like Nicolas Cage was a laughing stock, and then he had that rebound where he did all those cool movies like Adaptation and The Weatherman, right? And he did all
Well,
these
now
kind of
he's
like,
doing all these horror movies for Shudder. He's doing all these Lovecraft adaptations, and he did one there. I don't know the name of the director, but he seems to be working with Nicolas Cage as like a team in the late stage of his career. It's really good horror movie with like this very 70s aesthetic about a guy living like very happily with his wife in some cabin off in
Yeah,
the
that was called
woods.
Mandy, right?
Mandy, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It was good.
That was
It
a
was good.
wild movie. Yeah, yeah, wild. And then he did this new one called Pig, something
Right,
like
right.
that.
Yeah, I
Yeah, which
haven't.
I hadn't seen.
Yeah,
But that era, like the era of the star vehicle, is kind of over now. Like you
right. They're doing
can't
well. It's
bank
all
on big movie
franchise
stars
movies.
to sell movies anymore, to sell tickets anymore. And a big part of that has to do with not even streaming so much as just like YouTube, like the internet. Like, you know, 25 years ago, if you were a big Tom Cruise fan, the only way to see Tom Cruise would be to go see the new movie that he's in. Now if you're obsessed with Tom Cruise, you can YouTube Tom Cruise and hundreds, thousands of interviews come up and behind the scenes clips come up and compilations of his great, like you don't have to go and buy a ticket to see his new movie now. You have all this access to anything you want. So if you are like an obsessed fan, you could just, you could watch Tom Cruise all day right at home.
Well,
You don't have to go anymore.
I think it's also. I think I might have mentioned this on the show once. I was watching a video by a guy who really, covers like nerd culture, the critical drinker, and he dropped a video about why you don't have movie stars anymore the way that you used to. And his argument was their image used to be very tightly controlled by the studio.
Right.
They had people who ran interference for them and made sure they didn't say anything stupid. And, when they did interviews, they usually kept it on the project they were working on. When you really wanted to boost your sympathy level, you did the Barbara Walters special. You'd start crying about how your daddy wasn't
Right.
there, right? You would do that, and everybody would go, "Oh my God, did you see that interview?" Right? But they didn't talk politics. They didn't get into things like that. They were told by the studios not to get into things like that, so that when on the rare occasion someone like Marlon Brando did talk about things like that, it was a big fucking
Oh
deal.
yeah, right, exactly.
People
Yeah.
paid attention when he
Yep.
refused that Oscar because of the treatment of Native Americans. That was unusual back then. Today, that would almost be like de rigueur. That was like, what? What? Because actors didn't talk about things like that. You didn't really know if they were Democrats or Republicans for the most part, really. You kind of assumed John Wayne was probably a Republican. You would have, assumed Warren Beatty was a Democrat, but you didn't fucking know. Not really. Not until
Right.
later. And he argues once they got Twitter, now they've alienated so many people. They've become part of the culture wars. They're no longer able to stand as unifying symbols or ideals. Now they've gotten down into the shit with the mere mortals. So they can't be held up on those pedestals, which is what the old stars were, because you really know a lot about them.
And
Right?
that's
They were
right.
very remote. A Grace Kelly, a Cary Grant, they were very remote. They were very removed. They lived in an ethereal world, right?
Right.
Now, when you can interact with them on Twitter and see them bitching about the story of the day, it takes the shine off.
Well, it's the same thing like in the theater, right? Like, I mean, certain tiny little theaters are different, and actors have the ability to like mingle with the audience before the show. But even when I was running a, you know, tiny little black box theater, I was always very, very strict about that. I was like, when the house doors open, you are backstage. You do not come out at all before the show.
Mm-hmm,
It's very
mm-hmm,
important to
mm-hmm.
keep that
Right, right,
separation there. People
right,
cannot
right,
see you hanging out
right,
as Phil and then
right,
watch you go play Hamlet for 3 hours.
right,
You have to keep
right,
that separation there. And what social media does is sort of broke that, right?
right,
Where now
right,
these are just
right,
people
right,
mingling amongst everybody, and then you have to go and buy them as this other person. It
right,
doesn't quite
right,
work the exact same way.
right.
And but also like that idea of like these movie stars as unifying cultural figures, I think that also is what made the movies themselves sell as well in the 80s and 90s
Right,
as opposed
right.
to now, right? It was a more unified time. It was a
Yeah.
less political
There, there
time.
were there was
Just
no there was
day-to-day
no
life was not as
Democrats
political.
like
Right.
Rocky, Republicans like Rocky. Everybody likes Rocky.
Right.
It's fucking
Exactly.
Rocky,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
E.T.
Right.
It didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat. It was fucking E.T. But that was also, look, the screenwriters didn't put this stuff in there. It's
Well, like, look,
I
even a movie like Avatar, right,
mhm,
which was this huge hit, highest grossing movie of all time, right? Even that, and Cameron sort of put environmental themes into the script, sort of anti-imperialist themes. Yes, there were
mhm,
political themes
mhm,
in the
mhm,
movie.
mhm.
And even as this became the highest grossing movie of all time, which means it obviously was a unifier in that sense, you still had, and this is also a product of the internet where everybody has their own audience, right? You have certain writers trying to make it out to be more of a like statement film than it really was. And
Right,
so
right.
now, even those kinds of movies become sort of dragged into the culture war, even if they're really not designed that way.
Well, yes, but now they're going out of their way to hire. They hired for She-Hulk a woman who had no experience in TV, but she wrote a feminist book with, very obnoxious title, like A White Man's Guide to the White Male Literary Canon. This is who they got to write She-Hulk. And, as a result, you look at the trailer and you have, Mark Ruffalo telling her, the transformation is triggered by fear and anger, and Tatiana Maslany, who they got for She-Hulk, who's a brilliant actress. She says, fear and anger are the baseline existence of women. It's all of this inserting of the message
Right,
into
right,
into
right,
these
right.
movies, and it's going to turn people off. Now, I do think we're hitting a backlash. If you saw Netflix this week changed its statement for employees for the first time in about 10 years, saying, we produce content for a wide variety of people with diverse views. And hey, if you're going to find it hurtful to work on something that you don't agree with, Netflix might not be the right place for you.
Right, right, right.
They also quietly fired 150 people who were most deeply involved in the Dave Chappelle outcry from a few months ago. I think you're going to see more and more of these media companies doing that because overall, these are businesses. And what we've seen again and again is go woke, go broke. People
Right,
don't like this shit.
right.
And
It just
usually
it
when
doesn't
they
sell.
move in
Right,
that, who wants it? Who wants it? The people who consume this kind of media are usually not the people who respond well to that kind of messaging. And in the end, more people are going to like Dave Chappelle than are going to like what was her name, Hannah, um, the transgender comic from Australia.
oh yeah, I don't know her name.
All right, I mean, it was interesting how there were all of these articles about how this was the future of comedy. Who the fuck watched that? This is the future of comedy for you
Right.
and your six elite friends with advanced degrees.
Well,
This is
look, the
not
thing
this
about
is not the future of comedy. Looks a lot like the past of comedy. Dave
right,
Chappelle. People
right.
think Dave
Well,
Chappelle
exactly.
is
Yeah.
fucking funny.
Right.
Most people are not going to watch her comedy special.
There was a documentary that just came out on George Carlin. I think it came out yesterday. We should watch that for the show. We should review that for the show. I mean, I'm a huge fan of his. And I mean, yeah, that's the future of comedy. The future of comedy is what it's always been. It's what's funny works. What's not doesn't. And that way, comedy is like the purest form of art that there is because laughter is involuntary. You can't trick yourself into laughing at something that's not funny. And
Okay,
so you can't you can convince yourself that a movie like Crash is good because it's woke and anti-racist. You can kind of lie to yourself and say, okay, yeah, that was good, even though deep inside it wasn't. You can't do that with a guy on stage making jokes. You either laugh at them or you don't. And if it didn't invoke that response, it was no good. You know.
it's funny this is coming up. So I'm in a screenwriting class, and um, we start talking about Arthur, and the Dudley Moore, the
Yeah, yeah,
original
yeah.
Arthur. And the whole premise of that movie is very politically incorrect. It's making humor out of this guy being a drunk.
Right.
Um, But some of the jokes in that movie, they would fucking crucify you if you made these jokes now. Like, so much so, I'm going to repeat this. I don't think I would if this were not patrons only. There's a joke in there. If you remember, he picks up the two prostitutes at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
and he says to one of them, so why did you get into this line of work? And she goes, when I was 7 years old, my father raped me. And he goes, well, you had 6 good years at least.
Yeah, no, shit like that. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, man. I'm sorry. That's a funny joke because it's so over the line. It's so unexpected. And that, it so knocks you off balance.
Well, that's the
which
other
a good joke does.
That's the other thing about wokeness, and this doesn't just apply to comedy, it applies to all things, arts related. Wokeness isn't just off-putting because it's preachy and awkward. It doesn't work artistically because wokeness is the most predictable thing in the world.
Right.
And all art, whether it's comedy or drama or even music, it has to be unpredictable. It has to keep you guessing. If you're one step ahead of the movie's boring, right? You have to not see things coming, and wokeness is it's the most predictable thing. That's why Get Out was so good. That's what made Get Out work so well, because the first 20 minutes of the movie is designed to trick you into thinking it's a boring, woke, stupid, liberal movie. Like, they're driving down the road and he gets pulled over by the cop, and then his white girlfriend sticks up for him. No, you don't have to show him your ID. He's discriminating against you. And you're like rolling your eyes. Oh, okay. Then you realize later in the movie, the reason she didn't want him to show the ID, not because she was being this great woke anti-racist girlfriend, but because she didn't want the cops to know who to go look for when they give him the fucking brain operation and suck, so it took those expectations and flipped them on their head. That's why it worked so well. If it was just some stupid woke pablum, nobody would have cared. Nobody would have cared. Yeah.